We are talking, as we do each week, to State Senator Bruce Tarr. Hi, Senator. How are you?
I'm doing great, Heather. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I know you. Every week for you is busy, and this week everyone's talking about the budget. Do you want to just dive right in?
So yesterday was a particularly important day to talk about the budget because we had a reconvening of the panel of experts that the Ways and Means Committees rely on to estimate how much revenue we're going to have to support the budget. And just to go back a little bit, usually when the budget cycle starts, which is in January, the two Ways and Means Committees, the House and the Senate Committee, and the Secretary of Administration and Finance hold a hearing. And they ask various experts to come in and predict what they think we'll have for revenue in the coming fiscal year. And that actually happened in January this year. And the estimate was about $31.15 billion. But of course, we all know that estimate now is not realistic because of everything that's happened with the pandemic. So we do need to get a budget done, but it doesn't make sense to use that old benchmark. So yesterday, the same panel plus a few others were brought together to be able to give us new estimates. And the panel includes people like the Department of Revenue, the Treasurer of the Commonwealth, Deb Goldberg, folks from the Federal Reserve, folks from various think tanks like the Beacon Hill Institute. And we asked them all to give us their best estimate. And so we did get that estimate. And I think the one thing that runs through all of the estimates is uncertainty. And a lot of different factors were cited, like it will depend on what the federal government does, if anything, in terms of a stimulus to help buoy our economy. We have had a drop in unemployment in Massachusetts, but we're still very high. It also depends on what happens with the pandemic. Will there be a vaccine? Will there be therapeutic drugs? And it's rare that I've ever seen this much of a nexus between a public health issue and an economic issue, where the future of our finances is so closely connected to what happens with the pandemic. So having said all of that, the estimates ranged in between about being $2.5 billion short of what we need to about $5 billion short. And again, there were a whole host of variables involved in that. But what I found interesting is that in the past year, we collected about $29.5 billion. And some of the estimates that we heard yesterday actually got close to $29 billion. So you'd say, okay, well, if we're only that much short, why are we predicting such big deficits? And the answer is inflation. There are costs that we absolutely have to meet, and those costs are subject to inflationary forces. So for instance, pension costs, the cost of healthcare, our Medicaid program, while we try to control the cost of medical inflation, we're still subject to it. So there are things that we must adjust for in terms of accounting for inflation. But what it did give us a sense is we probably aren't going to see some of the dire predictions that we had heard earlier come to fruition, like $8 billion. It's probably going to be less than that, but it is going to be a very significant gap. And I would remind everybody that the stabilization fund has about $3.5 billion in it, which is a really solid stabilization fund. But when you're looking at a gap between $2.5 and $5 billion, that $3.5 billion doesn't look so big anymore. And one of the things that we're starting to hear from the folks that give us economic projections and the folks that help us to write the budget is that fiscal year 2021 may not be the worst year that we have to contend with, that we can solve this problem. It won't be easy, but we can solve it for this year. But next year, if we don't see significant improvement in the economy, we know we won't be able to replenish the stabilization fund in a robust way. Next year is going to be difficult.
2022, you mean? 2022?
22, yeah. So we're really walking a tightrope, and I know that you and I have talked about. Some folks have said, well, why don't we just wait until January and give ourselves more time, pass another supplemental budget, and try to get into the new year. The problem with that is that if we try to do a budget with only, let's say, 6 months left in the year, if we go from January to the end of June, then any cuts that have to be made have to be absorbed over a much more compressed period of time, which could mean real hardships for the people that have to deal with those cuts. So at the same time, the governor had indicated to us a few days ago, he needs to put together a budget proposal for fiscal year 22, and it has to be ready for sometime in January. So we're really in a time squeeze right now, trying to thread the needle of coming up with a budget proposal that covers us for the rest of the year and maintains a balanced budget, but also allows planning for the next fiscal year, 2022, because we think that one could be worse than 2021.
You know, might be a good time to ask about the eviction moratorium being lifted. More good news. So are we looking at a housing crisis on top of this?
Well, we're hoping to avoid that. And it seems right now that the governor's housing moratorium that was imposed by executive order is going to expire, and that's going to happen on October 17th. There is also legislation that was approved by the Housing Committee and is now in the House. And that's moving fairly quickly, but it's unclear that it will pass in time to overtake the October 17th date. And remember, too, that we also have a federal moratorium that was imposed through the CDC. And that one operates a little bit differently, so it doesn't cover as many people. But the point is, this isn't an issue we can walk away from. And so a lot of work is being done right now by the courts to try to figure out how to work through this process. There's a lot of discussion going on about the importance of mediation and trying to be able to get parties to work together so we don't have this sort of clear-cut eviction or non-eviction, in which case the landlord may continue not to get rent. The thought is we can help people to work together, but that's going to take resources. And so there's a huge inventorying process going on right now with the courts to say, how many mediators do you have? How many do you need? What can we do as the legislature and as the other side of state government that is not the judiciary to help with that? And then there's also something else. We have a program called RAFT, which is helps with arrearage. So if someone owes rent, in order to keep them in their house, we made a public policy decision years ago. It's better to help them pay the back rent than to have them get evicted and then try to find a new house. And then we have to try to spend money to help with that. So one of the things we're talking about is increasing the amount of RAFT. And we had a discussion today about increasing the amount of RAFT from remaining CARES Act federal funding that we still have. Now, we don't want to spend all of it on this, but the idea is if we can push that out and help people pay their arrearages, we're helping both the tenant and the landlord. And so there's a lot of discussion about that. So my prediction is that the governor's order will lapse on the 17th. I don't think we'll have a bill in place by then, but my hope is, and I think this is realistic, that we'll have a system by then to help people deal with these issues. Now, we may still need to act legislatively, and we may still do that, but I think the more near-term solution is something that's going to be developed with the administration, the courts, and the legislature.
So you also wanted to talk to us about the food security infrastructure grants.
This is actually one of my favorite topics and one of my favorite programs because, as you know, in the Senate, I chair the working group on supply chain issues. And obviously being able to make sure people can get food is a major supply chain issue. So we've been working to try to develop more food infrastructure, whether that be meat and poultry processing or better distribution or warehousing or helping our food pantries or developing new products through the fishing industry. And to their credit, the governor and lieutenant governor are using some of that federal money in a $36 million program called the Food Security Infrastructure Grant Program. And we just had the release of the third round of funding in that program. So out of $36 million, about 11 million, give or take, have been spent, closer to 12 million. which means that we have $24 million left. And we are trying to work hard to get some of that money into the commercial fishing industry. And so we've identified 38 applications that come from fishing industry stakeholders all up and down the coast, certainly a lot from Cape Ann, but a lot from other places as well, like New Bedford and Cape Cod. And we built a coalition, and Representative Ferranti is part of this coalition, as are a lot of my colleagues, to say to the administration, we really need an investment in the commercial fishing industry, and here are the applications that represent that. And so we have a letter that's gone off to support all of those applications, which is something fairly unique because legislators oftentimes work in silos where we might advocate for a grant application for someone who's directly in our district, and that's what we're supposed to do. But it's somewhat more unusual to say, we're gonna put all the applications together and say as a category, these things need to be supported with funding. And that effort has drawn 29 legislators who have said to the administration, we need to do better and we need to put money into the fishing industry. We very much welcome this program. It is critically important, and it's very, very important that the administration has decided, out of all the things to spend money on, to put $36 million into food security. And now we need to do a little bit better with getting some of that funding out to the fishing industry. So I've been very heartened by that, and I hope we're going to see some results soon. Again, because we have $24 million left in the program to be distributed.
Now, I'm going to say this, and I think some of our viewers, all those viewers out there, might say this. It feels like we've been talking about this for a long time, and the fishermen have not gotten very much money yet, right? Can you just talk about, I know it was way back in July when this CARES money was coming through and we were all excited about it. And the fact that it's October and we're still talking about, we hope those fishermen get it. Could you just speak to that delay?
I'm happy to, and I appreciate the question because I have felt the same way myself. And one of the reasons that we're now in the third round and we have not seen as much money go to people in farming communities in Western Massachusetts or in fishing communities in Eastern Massachusetts is because part of the design of the program was to prioritize social justice communities and to try to reach into communities where food security is a huge issue because of other factors in the community. And so we've seen a lot of money go to pantries and supply chains that are in those communities that have been particularly hard hit because of income levels and because people at the lower income levels have been more severely impacted by the pandemic than even others. So a lot of the money early on has been pushed out in that way. But you know, your legislative delegation, we're pretty persistent. And so we're saying we appreciate that, and we know that that's where it had to go. But we also need to make sure that it goes to other places as well. And as I have mentioned to you, it's important to talk about distributing the food in the communities that need it, but it's equally as important to talk about being able to produce the food in the communities that produce it. And that is certainly the kind of advocacy we're trying to bring to this subject.
The last thing we were going to talk about, and I talked to Taylor Bradford about this morning, and she told us you were there, were those trains in West Gloucester, right?
You know, that seems to be one of those persistent issues. It's probably more persistent than the food security, but it needs to be because, you know, people all along the rail line, and we talk a lot about West Gloucester, but there have also been people on Wolf Hill and in the condominiums that are near the bridge that have also suffered with noise issues since the spring. And we need to find a good solution. And in many ways, we think we have found some good solutions, but they still haven't been fully executed. And that was a big part of our meeting. But just to take a step back, we were able to convene a meeting, and the mayor and the representative have been very much a part of this, to bring MBTA officials to the West Gloucester train station. And we opened that up to as many people as wanted to come, although we were limited to 100 because of the outdoor gathering order. But a lot of people showed up. Everyone wore masks. They made good points, raised good issues. They even, Heather, on the MBTA side, brought a train and had us get on it and went through an evolution so we could understand the switching and the time delays and the relativities of those things. And so that was very good. But the main message was, we have to do better. And the MBTA got that message loud and clear from all of us. There were also city councilors there. City Councilor Nolan was there, and he was representing others like Councilor LeBlanc and Councilor Holmgren, who've been also very involved in this. And we did look at some new things, perhaps maybe bringing in a compressor station and an electrical generation station that could supply electricity and compressed air to the trains so they wouldn't have to idle. But a big question there is, would that station make more noise than the trains do?
That was
So
my
it's
immediate
not
point.
a silver bullet. So we're trying to look at that. We've also explored using more buses and less trains, and so that we could minimize the use that way. And there was also some discussion of making sure that the detention location where trains are supposed to idle, most of them by the Condolan Road Industrial Park, Cape Ann Industrial Park, that we move the train a little further out just to make sure that people in that neighborhood aren't adversely affected either. Because one thing we don't want to do is have this become a hot potato where we move it from one neighborhood to another, and all we're really doing is pushing the hardship on someone else to help the first set of people. So I think we're making good progress, but one thing we are absolutely all committed to is not giving up on this. And so one of the things that the MBTA is committed to do is hire someone called a line manager who can be on scene, watching what's going on, making sure that the trains are following the schedule, making sure that the bells and whistles don't get activated more than they need to be. And they clearly do need to be activated. There are federal safety rules that require those things, but we need to make sure that the rules are being followed and there aren't excessive use of those tools. So I think it was a very good discussion. We've compiled an email list to give people updates. And if anybody else wants to be on that email list, they should send me an email at bruce.tarr@masenate.gov, and we'd be happy to add them to the list. But I think we're making progress, but we have not solved the problem yet. And we're going to continue to work on that. And then also, I did talk to a few folks from Rockport today who are concerned that when service resumes, the trains will be idling back in Rockport. And again, we don't want to just move this problem from one place to the other. And so Representative Ferranti and I are working on setting up a meeting with MBTA officials and the Rockport Board of Selectmen and town manager to talk about that issue, to use the time now to try to come up with a solution before the trains are back idling in Rockport overnight.
Well, I have two things to ask you about that. One, do you think there's any chance we could use the fishing monitors to become linemen? Because it sounds like they actually have the same sorts of jobs, right? Only one is the fishing industry and one's the train. Right?
I like your creativity very much.
Right? There must be some spare fishing monitors we could put on those trains. And also, regarding what do other towns do? What do others, cities? This must happen all around the country where there are trains running. What happens in other neighborhoods?
Well, it's a good question. Oftentimes, siting solves the problem. Where trains are overnighting, there aren't a lot of houses, and there's been some research, and Representative Ferranti has done some research indicating that even in Massachusetts, there aren't that many layover locations that are actually proximal to homes. And so this is not as common a problem as you might think because of siting. But in our case, we really can't move the location. And I think we've talked about this in the past. For instance, if we try to move the idling trains in Rockport the way that we did in West Gloucester, we wind up in watershed area, and we don't want to jeopardize the environment. So the one thing that we found that seems to offer some promise, and Ted Costa from my office, who has been spending almost all of his time working on this issue and being out in the neighborhoods and monitoring the trains, is doing some research on some containment buildings that are actually used in London in a very populated area to be able to contain the noise of the trains. And apparently the technology they use to absorb the sound works very well. So that's the most promising thing that we're looking at right now. People, and even the folks that live along the lines now have told us as recently as the meeting that we had this week, that they know that they live near a train track. So the train passing is something they have to deal with. It's the train idling for long periods of time that creates a problem. And I was out one night this week watching a train in West Gloucester that was idling near Stanwood Street in the neighborhood for over an hour. And that's not something that those folks should have to deal with just because they live near a train track.
Another busy week on Beacon Hill. So thank you for catching us up with everything. And anything else you want to add to the week?
Well, no, I think we've covered a lot, and I really appreciate it. And I appreciate the chance to talk about it. And I just want to say how much I'm looking forward to what I hope will be a very special Halloween show coming from 1623 Studios.
You never know what we might have in our costume box. So, or on our programming. So we'll see. We'll see about that. Well, thank you very much, Senator, and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you. I look forward to it, Heather.
Take care.